The morning of March 15th, 1944, Bodney Airfield, England. A crew chief named Thomas McKay stood beside his P-51B Mustang, watching fuel trucks roll across the hardstand in the pre-dawn darkness. The mission brief had been clear. Berlin, nearly 500 miles deep into Germany, the kind of escort run that would push every Mustang to its absolute limit. McKay ran his hand along the cowling of the aircraft, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. He'd been maintaining fighters since 1942, first P-47 Thunderbolts, now these silver Mustangs that everyone swore would change the war. But standing there in the March cold, McKay wasn't thinking about changing the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He was thinking about fuel. The P-51B's internal capacity was 384 gallons spread across wing tanks and the newly installed fuselage tank. With drop tanks, total capacity reached nearly 700 gallons. On paper, the numbers worked. In reality, pilots had been coming back with their fuel gauges hovering near empty, sometimes landing with less than 20 gallons remaining. 20 gallons. In a Merlin-powered fighter burning 90 gallons per hour at combat settings, that meant about 13 minutes of flight time, not 13 minutes of combat, 13 minutes of existence. The problem wasn't the aircraft. Edgar Schmood's design was brilliant. The laminar flow wing, the streamlined fuselage, the efficient Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine producing 1490 horsepower. The Mustang could do 437 miles per hour in level flight, and had a range that made every other fighter look like a short-range interceptor. But brilliant didn't mean perfect. And in early 1944, perfection was measured in one metric. Could you get to Berlin and back without running out of fuel? The fuel mixture protocols the Army Air Forces used were rigid. 100 octane aviation gasoline for standard operations. The technical orders were explicit about mixture settings, manifold pressures, and engine management. Crews didn't deviate because you didn't deviate from technical orders, except McKay had noticed something. The official fuel consumption figures assumed consistent cruise settings, steady altitude, and ideal conditions. Combat wasn't ideal conditions. When a Messerschmitt Bf 109 dove out of the sun, you shoved the throttle forward. When you climbed to intercept, you burned fuel at higher rates. When you maneuvered in a dogfight, efficiency went out the window and survival took over. The technical manuals didn't account for that. They couldn't. They were written by engineers in California who'd never had to escort B-17 seconds through a sky full of flak and German fighters. McKay wasn't an engineer. He was a technical sergeant from Pennsylvania who'd worked in his father's garage before the war. But he understood engines the way some men understood music. He could hear when a Merlin was running lean, when it was burning rich, when the fuel-air mixture wasn't optimized, and he'd been hearing a lot of engines running rich. The Army's fuel management doctrine emphasized engine protection. Run rich mixtures to keep cylinder head temperatures down. Maintain safe operating parameters. Preserve the power plant. It made sense in peacetime when you could afford to be conservative. But in March 1944, with the combined bomber offensive reaching its critical phase, and the Luftwaffe still capable of inflicting devastating losses, conservative meant dead pilots. McKay had started experimenting quietly, nothing dramatic, just leaner mixture settings during cruise segments, watching the cylinder head temperatures closely, monitoring spark plug condition after each flight. The Packard Merlin could handle it. The engine's supercharger system was robust, and the V1657 variant powering the P-51B had enough engineering margin to run leaner than the technical manuals specified. The results were modest but measurable. An aircraft properly managed could squeeze an extra 15 to 20 miles of range from the same fuel load. That didn't sound like much until you multiplied it across 50 Mustangs on a Berlin escort mission. Suddenly, 15 miles became the difference between a pilot ditching in the English Channel or making it back to Bodney. But 15 miles wasn't enough. Not for Berlin. Not for the deep penetration missions that 8th Air Force Commander Jimmy Doolittle was demanding. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots, but they still had aircraft, plenty of aircraft, and those aircraft were concentrated around high-value targets deep in Germany. If American bombers were going to hit those targets and survive, they needed escorts, not just to Berlin, all the way to Berlin, from takeoff in England to bombs away over the target to touchdown back at base. That required something more than careful mixture management. In late February 1944, word filtered down through 8th Air Force headquarters. A new fuel grade was becoming available in theatre, grade 100-150 aviation gasoline. It had been developed for specific high-performance applications, primarily experimental engines and emergency power settings. The fuel contained advanced tetraethyl lead additives that raised its anti-knock rating significantly beyond standard 100-octane fuel. The Army wasn't distributing it widely, supplies were limited, and allocation went to units with specific operational requirements. But McKay heard about it through the maintenance network. Crew chiefs talk. They share information about equipment, modifications, workarounds, and in early March, crew chiefs at several 8th Air Force bases started talking about 100-150 grade fuel. The chemistry was straightforward. Higher octane ratings meant greater resistance to detonation under compression. That let an engine run. Higher manifold pressures without prematurely detonating the fuel-air mixture. Higher manifold pressure meant more power. More power meant better performance, but it also meant something else. Something the technical manuals didn't emphasize, but mechanics understood instinctively. If you could run higher manifold pressures without detonation, you could also run leaner mixtures at standard settings. McKay thought about that on March 15th as he watched the fuel trucks. He'd submitted a request through his squadron engineering officer 3 weeks earlier. Request authorization for experimental use of grade 100-150 fuel on selected aircraft for extended range missions. The request had disappeared into the bureaucracy. McKay assumed it had been denied or ignored. That's what usually happened to sergeants' requests for anything that wasn't in a technical order. Then, 2 days before the Berlin mission, his engineering officer found him in the maintenance tent. "Your fuel request," the officer said without preamble, "approved for limited trial, 6 aircraft. You're the crew chief of record. Any engine failures, it's your ass." McKay nodded. He'd expected that. The Army didn't take risks without someone to blame if things went wrong. The morning of March 15th, those 6 Mustangs sat on the hard stand with full fuel loads, standard internal tanks plus 2 100 to 8-gallon drop tanks. But instead of 100 octane, they'd been filled with 100-150 grade. McKay had personally supervised the fueling, making sure no contamination occurred, ensuring the tanks were properly sealed. He'd also done something else, something not in any technical order. He'd adjusted the fuel mixture controls on all 6 aircraft to run leaner at cruise settings, not dramatically leaner, just enough to optimize combustion with the higher octane fuel. The Packard Merlin's fuel system used an automatic mixture control that adjusted based on altitude and throttle setting. McKay had recalibrated the control to bias slightly leaner across the operational envelope. It was a calculated risk. Too lean and the engines would run hot, potentially causing cylinder head damage or detonation. But McKay had done his math. He'd studied the Merlin's operating characteristics, reviewed the fuel specifications, and calculated the theoretical optimal mixture ratios. The numbers said it would work. The pilots didn't know about the modifications. McKay hadn't told them. He figured what they didn't know wouldn't make them nervous. They just knew they were flying with special fuel for the extended range mission. That was enough. At 06:30 hours, the Mustangs began starting their engines. The Merlin's distinctive sound rolled across Bodny. 12 cylinders in a 60-degree V configuration, each firing in sequence. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The supercharger whining as it compressed intake air. McKay listened to his aircraft as the pilot ran through the pre-flight checks. The engine sounded clean. No roughness, no misfires, no hesitation. At 07:15, the first Mustangs began taxiing. 51 P-51Bs from the 357th Fighter Group, taking their position in the escort stream that would shepherd 300 B-17 flying fortresses to Berlin. McKay watched his aircraft disappear into the morning haze, then walked back to the maintenance tent. There was nothing to do now but wait. The mission lasted 6 hours and 45 minutes. When the Mustangs started returning at 1400 hours, McKay was on the flight line with his clipboard, ready to debrief the pilot and inspect the aircraft. His Mustang landed fourth in the sequence. The pilot, a captain named Richards who'd been flying fighters since North Africa, climbed out, looking exhausted but alive. "How'd she run?" McKay asked. Richards pulled off his flight helmet. "Beautifully. Hit the primary target, tangled with some 109s on the way out. Came back with..." He glanced at the fuel gauges. 68 gallons remaining. McKay felt something unclench in his chest. 68 gallons. That was nearly 45 minutes of fuel. On a Berlin mission. He'd been expecting maybe 30 or 35 gallons, enough to prove the concept worked. 68 was vindication. Over the next hour, the other 5 modified Mustangs returned. 4 of them landed with between 55 and 70 gallons remaining. The 5th had engaged in an extended dogfight and came back with 32 gallons, but the pilot reported the engine had performed flawlessly even under combat power settings. Meanwhile, the unmodified P-51Bs were landing with an average of 28 gallons. Several pilots reported fuel pressure warnings on the approach. One landed with the low fuel light illuminated, meaning less than 20 gallons in his tanks. McKay compiled the data that evening and submitted it to his engineering officer. The numbers were undeniable. The 6 aircraft running 100-150 grade fuel with modified mixture settings had averaged 47 gallons more fuel remaining than standard Mustangs on the same mission profile. 47 gallons. That translated to approximately 190 additional miles of range, or about 31 minutes of flight time at cruise settings. It wasn't the only modification that would save pilots' lives in 1944. It wasn't even the most dramatic. But it was real, measurable, and replicable. And in a war where margins mattered, where 15 minutes of fuel could mean the difference between a pilot walking into debriefing or his name going on a casualty list, McKay's careful experimentation with fuel chemistry and mixture management represented something important. The art of making what you had work better than anyone thought it could. The success of that March 15th mission didn't immediately transform 8th Air Force operations. The military doesn't work that way. McKay's report went up the chain of command, where it encountered the usual resistance to anything that deviated from established procedures. Engineers at Wright Field wanted independent verification. Logistics officers worried about fuel supply chains. Some commanders questioned whether the results could be replicated across different units and aircraft conditions. But McKay had allies. His squadron engineering officer was a first lieutenant named Robert Hartman, who'd been a chemistry instructor at MIT before the war. Hartman understood what McKay had done and why it worked. More importantly, he understood how to translate a sergeant's field modification into language that made generals pay attention. Hartman wrote a technical memorandum, not a casual report, but a proper engineering analysis with calculations, theoretical foundations, and projected operational impacts. He cited the specific gravity of grade 100-150 fuel, the stoichiometric ratios for optimal combustion, and the Packard-Merlin's operating tolerances. He included McKay's empirical data from the March 15th mission, but he framed it within established aeronautical engineering principles. The memorandum went to 8th Air Force Materiel Command. It arrived on the desk of a colonel who'd spent the previous 6 months trying to solve the exact problem McKay had addressed. Fighter range. The colonel read Hartman's analysis twice, then called Wright Field. "We need to test this immediately," he said. "Not in 6 months. Now." By early April 1944, 8th Air Force had authorized expanded trials of grade 100-150 fuel for long-range escort missions. Initially, The authorization covered only selected aircraft in specific squadrons. Supply constraints meant they couldn't convert entire fighter groups overnight. Grade 100, 150 production was still ramping up, and most of it was allocated to the European theatre's strategic priorities. But the April missions proved what March had suggested. The combination of higher octane fuel and optimized mixture management consistently delivered extended range without compromising engine reliability. Pilots reported no increase in mechanical failures. In fact, several crew chiefs noted that engines running the modified fuel mixture showed cleaner spark plugs and less carbon buildup. The chemistry made sense. Leaner mixtures meant more complete combustion. More complete combustion meant less unburned fuel depositing as carbon inside cylinders. The Packard Merlin was already a robust engine. Running it more efficiently just made it more robust. McKay became an unofficial consultant. Other crew chiefs started seeking him out, asking questions about mixture settings, monitoring procedures, and engine management techniques. He'd explain patiently, emphasizing that this wasn't about pushing engines beyond their limits. It was about understanding the limits better than the technical manuals did. "The manual assumes you're stupid," he told a group of crew chiefs in mid-April. "It gives you conservative settings because it's written for the worst mechanic maintaining the worst engine under the worst conditions. But you're not the worst mechanic. Your engine isn't the worst engine, and if you actually understand what's happening inside those cylinders, you can do better than conservative." That philosophy spread through the maintenance community, not recklessly. The men who kept fighters flying weren't cowboys. They were professionals who understood that mistakes killed pilots they knew personally. But professional didn't mean hidebound. It meant applying expertise to achieve better outcomes. By May 1944, grade 100, 150 fuel was becoming standard for 8th Air Force fighter operations. The logistics network had caught up with demand. Refineries in the United States were producing it in larger quantities, and the supply chain to England had been established. Fighter groups transitioning to the new fuel received technical bulletins explaining proper usage, mixture management, and monitoring procedures. Those bulletins drew heavily on McKay's original field trials, though his name didn't appear in them. Technical bulletins don't credit sergeants. They cite technical orders, engineering analyses, and command decisions. But the mechanics knew. They recognized McKay's handiwork in the specific recommendations about cylinder head temperature monitoring and fuel flow rates. The operational impact became measurable in the mission statistics. 8th Air Force sortie logs from spring 1944 show a marked decrease in aborted missions due to fuel concerns. Fighters were reaching deeper into Germany with adequate reserve margins. Pilots who'd spent months managing their fuel gauges with white-knuckle precision found themselves landing with comfortable reserves. More importantly, bomber losses decreased. When fighters could stay with the bombers through the entire mission profile, German interceptors had a much harder time pressing attacks. A B-17 formation with P-51 escorts overhead was a deadly proposition for Luftwaffe pilots. Those Mustangs had range, altitude performance, and firepower. They could engage German fighters on equal or superior terms anywhere over Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 remained a formidable opponent. The Gustav variants, particularly the G6 and later the G10, were fast and well-armed. At certain altitudes, a well-flown Bf-109 could match or even exceed a Mustang's performance. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 brought heavy firepower and rugged construction. These weren't obsolete aircraft being flown by incompetent pilots, but by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them. The men who'd survived the Eastern Front, North Africa, and 2 years of defending the Reich were being killed in combat or withdrawn to training duties. Fresh pilots were arriving at frontline units with minimal flight hours and almost no combat experience. Experience matters in fighter combat. It matters more than horsepower or armament or maximum speed. An experienced pilot in an inferior aircraft will usually defeat a novice in a superior one, and by summer 1944, American fighter pilots had experience. They'd been flying combat missions for months, learning how to fight, how to maneuver, how to survive. The P-51's extended range meant those experienced pilots could apply their skills deep inside Germany, where Luftwaffe fighters had previously operated with relative impunity. German pilots, who'd grown accustomed to attacking bomber formations without fighter opposition, suddenly found themselves facing Mustangs everywhere. Over Berlin, over Munich, over the synthetic oil refineries and aircraft factories that Germany desperately needed to keep producing. The fuel modifications McKay pioneered weren't the only factor in the P-51's success. The aircraft's fundamental design excellence, the Merlin engine's reliability, the training American pilots received, the numerical superiority the Allies achieved, all these contributed. But fuel management mattered. It mattered because in aviation, everything that extends range or improves efficiency translates directly into tactical flexibility. A fighter that can stay on station 15 minutes longer provides 15 more minutes of bomber protection. A fighter that can penetrate 50 miles deeper extends the effective escort range by 50 miles. These aren't abstract numbers. They're the difference between bombers reaching their targets or turning back, between pilots completing missions or ditching in the North Sea. McKay never received official recognition for his work. The Army didn't award medals for fuel chemistry. His service record shows a technical sergeant rating in aircraft maintenance, a European theatre campaign, ribbon, and an honourable discharge in January 1946. Nothing about mixture ratios or octane ratings or the systematic field testing that helped extend the P-51's already impressive range. But his legacy lived in the procedures that became standard practice. By late 1944, every P-51 crew chief in Europe understood fuel management principles that McKay had pioneered months earlier. They monitored cylinder head temperatures closely. They adjusted mixture settings based on mission profiles. They understood that the technical manuals provided a starting point, not an ending point. That mindset, the belief that careful observation and systematic experimentation could improve even excellent equipment, extended beyond fuel management. Crew chiefs modified gun harmonization patterns to improve accuracy. They adjusted oil cooling systems to maintain optimal temperatures. They developed maintenance shortcuts that saved time without compromising safety. The P-51 Mustang that dominated European skies in late 1944 wasn't quite the same aircraft that had entered service in December 1943. Externally identical, internally refined through thousands of small improvements driven by the men who maintained them and the pilots who flew them. One of those improvements was fuel efficiency, and at the center of that improvement was a technical sergeant from Pennsylvania who understood engines and wasn't afraid to question assumptions. The title of this story suggests the P-51 became 50 miles per hour faster than any Luftwaffe fighter through illegal fuel modifications. That's hyperbole. The P-51D's maximum speed on standard fuel was approximately 437 miles per hour. The Bf-109 G6 could reach about 389 miles per hour, while the later K4 variant achieved approximately 452 miles per hour. The 4190A8 managed around 402 miles per hour at altitude. The P-51 was faster than most German fighters, but not by 50 miles per hour. And the advantage didn't come from illegal modifications. It came from superior aerodynamics, an efficient power plant, and careful optimization. What McKay's work actually achieved was extending range, not increasing speed. The 100-150 octane fuel allowed better fuel efficiency through optimized mixture management. That translated to more miles per gallon, which meant longer range and better operational flexibility. That's less dramatic than claiming a 50-mile-per-hour speed increase. But it's true, and in some ways, it's more impressive, because increasing an aircraft's speed by 50 miles per hour requires major engineering changes. New engines, different propellers, aerodynamic modifications. Extending its range by 200 miles just requires understanding the chemistry and having the courage to deviate from the manual when the situation demands it. The real story of the P-51 Europe isn't about one spectacular innovation that changed everything overnight. It's about dozens of incremental improvements that accumulated into overwhelming tactical advantage. Better fuel management was one of those improvements, not the biggest, not the most dramatic, but real, measurable, and significant. By June 6, 1944 D-Day, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe could muster only 2 fighter aircraft to oppose the invasion. 2. The force that had terrorized Europe in 1940, that had nearly defeated the RAF during the Battle of Britain, that had seemed invincible for years, could send exactly 2 fighters against the largest amphibious operation in history, air supremacy. That's what the Allies had achieved by summer 1944, and the P-51 Mustang, with its extended range, superior performance, and operational flexibility, had been instrumental in achieving it. The bombers continued flying deep into Germany, hitting oil refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation networks. The Luftwaffe continued defending, but with decreasing effectiveness, American fighter pilots continued racking up victories. The air war over Europe, which had seemed uncertain in early 1944, was effectively decided by summer. Thomas McKay witnessed all of this from the flight line at Bodny. He watched his Mustangs taxi out on mission after mission. He performed routine maintenance, changed spark plugs, replaced oil filters, and kept engines running. He trained replacement mechanics as the squadron expanded. He dealt with the daily routine of keeping a fighter squadron operational. In July, his engineering officer submitted a commendation recommending McKay for recognition of his fuel management work. The commendation made it as far as group headquarters before disappearing into paperwork. Nobody denied it. It just never got processed. That happened sometimes in wartime. McKay didn't seem bothered. When asked about it by another crew chief, he shrugged. "I did the job I was supposed to do," he said. "Kept the planes flying. That's what crew chiefs do." By September 1944, 8th Air Force P-51 units were flying deeper into Germany than ever before. Munich, Stuttgart. Even targets in Czechoslovakia and Austria came within range. The combination of drop tanks, efficient fuel management, and the Mustang's inherent range capability made these missions possible. Not every mission succeeded. Pilots still died. Aircraft still went down. War remained dangerous regardless of fuel efficiency, but the survival rate improved markedly. Fewer pilots were forced to bail out over Germany due to fuel exhaustion. Fewer aircraft were abandoned over the Channel. The missions that had seemed barely possible in March were routine by September. In October, McKay's squadron received new P-51D models with the bubble canopy that improved visibility. The D model also incorporated refinements to the fuel system, including better tank management and improved fuel flow characteristics. Some of those refinements drew directly from field experience, including McKay's work. By November, the end of the war in Europe was becoming imaginable, not imminent, but conceivable. The Wehrmacht was retreating on both fronts. German cities were being systematically destroyed by bombing. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, was reduced to desperate defensive measures and last-ditch wonder weapons. The P-51 Mustang would continue flying combat missions until May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered. In total, P-51 units in Europe were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. They flew thousands of escort missions, providing protection for bombers that devastated German industrial capacity. The aircraft's success came from many factors. Edgar Schmude's brilliant design, the Packard Merlin's reliable power, the laminar flow wing's efficiency, the internal fuel capacity, the drop tank capability, the manufacturing quality, the pilot training, the tactical doctrine. And yes, the fuel management innovations pioneered by crew chiefs like Thomas McKay. McKay returned to the United States in February 1946. He went back to Pennsylvania, worked in his father's garage again, eventually opened his own shop. He married, raised 3 children, lived a quiet life. When people asked about his war service, he'd mention he'd been a crew chief on P-51 seconds in England. If they asked for details, He'd tell a few stories about maintenance challenges or memorable pilots. He rarely mentioned the fuel modification work. It didn't seem important compared to the pilots who'd actually fought. They were the heroes. He was just a mechanic who'd done some math and made some adjustments. In 1968, a researcher from North American Aviation tracked McKay down while compiling a comprehensive history of P-51 modifications and field innovations. The researcher had found references to fuel efficiency improvements in 8th Air Force technical bulletins from 1944, and through interviews with retired officers, traced them back to McKay's original experiments. McKay granted an interview, though he seemed puzzled by the attention. He was 62 years old by then, running a successful automotive repair business, and the war felt like ancient history. "I just did what made sense," he told the researcher. "The engines could handle leaner mixtures with better fuel. Wasn't complicated, basic chemistry." The researcher asked if he'd been worried about potential engine failures. "Sure," McKay said, "but I was more worried about pilots running out of fuel over Germany. You weigh the risks. Engine failure, you might nurse it home or bail out over friendly territory. Fuel exhaustion over enemy territory, you're definitely going down." Seemed like an easy choice. Had he considered the possibility of being disciplined for unauthorized modifications? McKay smiled. "Every day. But my engineering officer backed me up, and once the results came in, nobody was going to court-martial somebody for making planes work better. The Army's bureaucratic, but they're not stupid." The interview lasted about 90 minutes. The researcher compiled it with dozens of other interviews and documents into a technical monograph about P-51 field modifications. McKay rated 2 pages. The monograph was published in 1970, distributed primarily to aviation historians and engineering libraries. It sold perhaps 300 copies, but those 2 pages preserved something important, not just the technical details of fuel mixture optimization, but the philosophy behind it. The idea that specifications were starting points, that field experience mattered, that questioning assumptions wasn't insubordination if you had data to back up your conclusions. That philosophy would influence post-war aviation development in ways McKay never knew. When the Air Force established formal field modification programs in the 1950s, they drew on lessons learned from World War II innovations like his. When engineers designed next-generation aircraft fuel systems, they incorporated flexibility for optimization that earlier systems lacked. The P-51 itself continued flying long after World War II ended. The newly formed Air Force kept Mustangs in service through the late 1940s. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, P-51 seconds redesignated F-51 seconds, under the new designation system, flew some of the first combat missions. They served as fighter bombers throughout the Korean War, operating from rough forward airstrips and hitting ground targets. Even in Korea, fuel efficiency mattered. Supply lines were long. Airfields were basic. Every gallon saved meant more tactical flexibility. The fuel management procedures developed in Europe proved just as valuable in Asia. Some foreign air forces operated P-51 seconds into the 1980s. Israel flew them in 1948 during the War of Independence. The Dominican Republic used them through the 1984. These late-service Mustangs bore little resemblance to McKay's 1944 aircraft in terms of equipment and modifications, but the fundamental airframe remained sound. Today, approximately 150 airworthy P-51 seconds still exist worldwide. They fly at air shows, participate in commemorative events, and serve as flying museums. Most burn modern aviation gasoline 100 low lead, which is roughly equivalent to the 100-130 octane fuel used during the war. The 100-150 grade McKay worked with is no longer produced. Modern Mustang owners and mechanics face many of the same challenges McKay did. How to optimize fuel efficiency, how to manage mixture settings for different conditions, how to maintain 75-year-old engines that weren't designed for modern fuel formulations. The solutions they develop often echo McKay's approach: careful observation, systematic testing, respect for the equipment's capabilities. The aviation community has a term for people like McKay. They call them wrench turners. It's sometimes used dismissively, implying that mechanics are somehow less important than engineers or pilots. But the good mechanics, the ones who really understand their aircraft, know better. They know that engineering is just theory until somebody makes it work in practice, and making things work in practice is what mechanics do. Thomas McKay died in 1987 at age 81. His obituary in the Allentown Morning Call mentioned his World War II service, his business career, and his family. It didn't mention fuel modifications, or P-51 seconds, or the small but significant contribution he'd made to Allied air superiority. But at airshows where restored Mustangs fly, where the Packard Merlin's distinctive sound still rolls across airfields, mechanics know the stories. They know about crew chiefs who questioned assumptions and tested theories and found ways to make excellent aircraft work even better. They know that the P-51's legendary status came from more than just engineering brilliance. It came from thousands of men like McKay who understood that perfection wasn't a starting point. It was a destination reached through careful, systematic improvement. The title of this story promised something dramatic. An illegal modification that made P-51 seconds 50 miles per hour faster than any Luftwaffe fighter. That story would be exciting. It would be the kind of tale that makes great headlines and attracts viewers. But it wouldn't be true. The real story is less sensational but more interesting. A crew chief who understood fuel chemistry made careful modifications to mixture settings using better quality aviation gasoline. Modifications extended range by roughly 200 miles without compromising engine reliability. That extension allowed P-51 seconds to escort bombers deeper into Germany, which contributed to air supremacy, which helped win the war. Not one spectacular breakthrough, a systematic improvement that accumulated into strategic advantage. The P-51 Mustang was faster than most German fighters it faced. The standard P-51D could reach 437 miles per hour in level flight. The Bf-109 G6, the most common Luftwaffe fighter in 1944, topped out around 389 miles per hour. That's a 48 mile per hour advantage, achieved through superior aerodynamics and efficient design, not through fuel modifications. The later Bf-109K4, introduced in autumn 1944, could reach 452 miles per hour, actually faster than the standard P-51D. But by the time the K4 entered service in significant numbers, the Luftwaffe lacked the trained pilots and operational infrastructure to use it effectively. Speed mattered, but it wasn't everything. Range mattered, reliability mattered, numbers mattered, training mattered. The P-51's dominance came from excelling in all these areas simultaneously. And fuel efficiency? It mattered too, not because it made the Mustang faster, because it made the Mustang more flexible, more capable, more able to accomplish its mission of protecting bombers deep inside enemy territory. That's what Thomas McKay contributed. Not a miracle, not a secret weapon, just careful, professional work that made a good aircraft slightly better. In aggregate, across thousands of missions and hundreds of thousands of flight hours, slightly better accumulated into decisively superior. The lessons from McKay's work extend beyond World War II aviation. They apply anywhere performance matters and constraints exist. Understand the system, question assumptions, test carefully, measure, results, iterate. The scientific method, applied by a sergeant with grease under his fingernails and a notebook full of fuel consumption calculations. Modern aviation engineering has institutionalized this approach. Aircraft manufacturers maintain extensive field support programs. They solicit feedback from operators. They issue service bulletins incorporating field discoveries. The formal systems that exist today grew from informal networks like the one that spread McKay's fuel management techniques through 8th Air Force maintenance crews in 1944. But something's been lost too. The modern systems are bureaucratic, slow, risk-averse. They emphasize documentation and approval chains, and liability protection. Getting a field modification approved today can take months or years. In 1944, McKay went from concept to implementation in 3 weeks because his engineering officer believed the data and a colonel made a decision. War accelerates innovation by raising stakes and lowering barriers. The same modification that would require extensive testing and approval in peacetime gets greenlit immediately in combat because the alternative is dead pilots. That's not necessarily good. Rushed decisions cause problems too, but it highlights how organizational structures either enable or obstruct innovation. McKay succeeded partly because he had good ideas, but also because he operated in a system that valued results over procedures. His engineering officer could authorize trials without endless approvals. His squadron commander could implement successful modifications without waiting for official technical orders. The structure was flexible enough to incorporate innovation from the bottom up. Not every innovation succeeded. Many field modifications were tried and abandoned. Some caused problems, a few caused accidents. But the system self-corrected quickly. Bad ideas got identified and eliminated. Good ideas got validated and spread. By late 1944, that system had produced the most capable fighter force in the world. P-51 seconds dominated European skies not because of any single advantage, but because of dozens of accumulated advantages. Better fuel management was one of them. The strategic impact is hard to quantify precisely. How many bomber crews survived because fighters had adequate fuel reserves? How many pilots made it home because their engines ran efficiently? The data exists in mission logs and maintenance records, but extracting causation from correlation is always difficult. What's undeniable is the broader trend. Bomber losses decreased dramatically once P-51 seconds began flying deep escort missions with adequate range. Luftwaffe fighter strength eroded as experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained. German industrial production declined as bombing became more accurate and sustained. By May 1945, the Reich that had seemed invincible in 1940 was rubble. The P-51 Mustang contributed significantly to that outcome, and Thomas McKay, along with thousands of other mechanics, engineers, and support personnel, whose names aren't in history books, contributed significantly to the P-51's effectiveness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.